If you've ever felt completely betrayed by the people who are supposed to love you most, then you're going to want to hear this. Welcome to Her Retaliation, and don't forget to subscribe because this story is going to shake you to your core. I stared at my phone, frozen, as my father's words sank in. Stay away from the wedding. Cold, calculated. Every single word felt like a punch to my chest. I had spent years bending over backward for this family, sacrificing comfort, time, even dreams I had quietly cherished. And now, in one short sentence, my entire existence in their eyes had been dismissed. Then came my sister. Her response was a laughing emoji, just a tiny digital smirk, but to me it was venom. She didn't even try to mask her contempt. She thought this was a joke. She thought I would just take it and continue paying for every extravagant whim, every unnecessary expense of her upcoming wedding. She thought I'd remain the silent, invisible supporter who quietly foots the bills while they live in luxury. But I had spent long enough being invisible. My reply was deliberate, sharp, and cold. Then I'll stop funding the marriage. The laughter in the family chat thread continued for 10 more minutes, as if they were the only ones who had a right to feel amused. I paused the shared payments I had been covering for months, the money they believed was their lifeline. The notification blinked on my screen, payment paused. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of excitement, a thrill that something had finally shifted. For years, I had given quietly, expecting nothing in return. And for years, they had taken it all, laughed at me, and never thought twice. But now the scales were tilting. My name is Sofia Marlowe, and this was the beginning of their nightmare. I didn't reply immediately when my father called. I let the phone ring, my hand hovering above it, enjoying the slight panic that must be creeping into their minds. When I finally answered, I kept my voice calm, almost indifferent. Yes, I said as though nothing had happened. The panic in their tone when I finally spoke was intoxicating. They didn't know what I was capable of. I had spent years quietly observing them, watching their habits, noting their vulnerabilities, learning their secrets. My father's obsession with appearances, my sister's shallow sense of superiority, their entire family's reliance on me to quietly fix their mistakes. It had all been catalogued in my mind like an invisible ledger. Every insult, every laugh, every scornful glance had been filed away, a blueprint for what was about to come. 10 minutes later, messages flooded my phone. My sister, Sofia, what did you do? The payments. Why are they stopped? My father, this is unacceptable. Fix it immediately. My calm, collected response, silence. Let them stew in their own panic. The absence of my compliance was louder than any argument I could have made. I had begun small, calculated maneuvers. Not just the payments, they were merely the opening move, but small shifts in my financial control that they would never suspect. Accounts redirected, funds rerouted, subtle yet irreversible changes. Each step was deliberate. I watched the panic build in real time, savoring every moment. Yet it wasn't just about money. Revenge had to be layered, psychological. They needed to feel the consequences of their entitlement, to experience for themselves the fear of losing control over someone they always assumed powerless. Over the next week, I maintained the facade of normalcy. I answered texts politely, kept my tone neutral, never revealing the extent of my actions. But inside, I was orchestrating an unraveling they could never anticipate. I planted little hints here and there, subtle mentions of financial shifts, reminders of the sacrifices I had made quietly, which they had twisted into my supposed duty. Friends began noticing my absence from family events, the lack of financial support, the quiet resistance I now wielded like a weapon. And as the family's anxiety grew, their laughter turned to confusion. They had always underestimated me. They had never considered that the quiet, compliant daughter could evolve into someone capable of meticulous, devastating retaliation. One evening, my sister's panic reached a crescendo. She called me, voice trembling. "Sofia, this is insane. Why are you doing this?" I let a small, almost imperceptible smile curl my lips. "You laughed at me," I said softly, letting the words hang in the air. "And now you're finally seeing that there are consequences." From that night onward, I escalated. Every financial thread I controlled, I subtly tightened. The wedding they had planned with so much arrogance and entitlement began to falter. Vendors called me directly, uncertain about payments. Guests began to receive cryptic messages about cancellations. My father's polite tone was now replaced with pleading and veiled threats, and my sister's teasing emojis turned into frantic, angry texts. But I wasn't done. Revenge, I realized, was also about exposure. About showing them the truth of their selfishness, their cruelty, their inability to appreciate the sacrifices of those who truly love them. I began leaking subtle truths. not enough to outright slander, but enough to make friends, distant relatives, and even social media witnesses see the family dynamic for what it was. The narrative was slowly shifting, and they had no control over it. Sitting in my apartment, watching their lives slowly crumble under the weight of their own arrogance, I finally allowed myself a long, deep breath. I had gone from the obedient daughter to the orchestrator of their unraveling, and the taste of that transformation was sweeter than I ever imagined. They had mocked me, they had laughed. They had assumed I would always bend, always pay, always sacrifice. And now, with each carefully calculated move, I was reclaiming not only my money but my dignity, my power, and my sense of justice. This was only the beginning, the real retaliation. The part where they truly understood the consequences of underestimating me was yet to come, and I, Sofia Marlowe, would make sure they never forgot it. The days after pausing the payments were almost delicious in their chaos. My family scrambled like ants tipped upside down, unable to comprehend how the quiet, compliant daughter they had dismissed was now the architect of their discomfort. And the more they panicked, the more I realized that the true power of revenge isn't just in money. It's in control, in watching them twist themselves into knots while you remain untouched. My father's calls became obsessive. Every day I'd receive at least 3, each time his voice trembling, trying to mask anger with authority. "Sofia, you have no right to do this, fix it immediately." And every time I replied the same way, calm, polite, but with a tone that made it clear I wasn't budging. "I'm not sure what you're referring to. Perhaps you should check your accounts again." The subtle escalation was key. I didn't just block payments. I redistributed funds, redirected them into accounts that only I could access. I made minor delays on wedding-related deposits that vendors had become accustomed to receiving on time. They noticed, yes, but they had no idea who was behind it. The seeds of confusion grew into panic. Then there was my sister, always so smug, always so convinced she had power over me. She sent a barrage of messages, alternating between pleading and mocking, trying to manipulate me emotionally. "Sofia, we're family. You can't do this." Followed by, "You're being ridiculous. Can't you just let us have this?" The duality of her tone only fueled my resolve. I didn't respond immediately. I let her stew in uncertainty, let her imagine the worst possible consequences of her arrogance. But retaliation is never purely reactive. It has to be creative. So I began to plant information strategically, hints that would unravel their sense of control. Small truths about how much I had done for them, tiny examples of their own entitlement, woven into conversations with relatives and mutual friends. Nothing obvious, just enough for people to start questioning the narrative they had always believed. One night, as I sat reviewing my carefully orchestrated moves, I realized the most powerful revenge wasn't just financial or logistical. It was emotional. I had to make them feel the loss of respect, the fear of not having control, the humiliation of being outmaneuvered by someone they considered weak. The wedding, which they had planned like a spectacle, began to crumble subtly. Vendors called me directly with questions about missing deposits. Invitations were delayed. Guests received confusing updates. My sister texted me late one night, her voice uncharacteristically low and frantic. "Sofia, why are you doing this? You've never acted like this before. This isn't you." I let a small, satisfied smile form. Maybe this is me finally standing up. I replied, letting her panic deepen. Meanwhile, my father tried to rally the family's sympathy, portraying me as unreasonable and vindictive. But because of the seeds I had planted, nobody fully believed him. Friends who had witnessed my sacrifices over the years began asking questions. Colleagues started mentioning the efforts I had quietly made for them. I wasn't just fighting back, I was rewriting the narrative. By now, my own confidence had transformed into a near-addictive thrill. Every text, every missed payment, every confused call felt like a chess move. And they were pawns they hadn't realized they were becoming. Then came the most audacious step. I started hinting at legal consequences. Subtle mentions in casual conversations about how someone in my position could take steps to protect their finances. The threat was implied, not explicit, but enough to make my father start second, guessing every decision he had ever made regarding me. He had assumed I would bend to his will, as I always had. Now he feared what I might actually do. I could hear the desperation in my sister's voice the next morning. "Sofia, please, we can work something out. Don't do anything you'll regret." I leaned back in my chair, enjoying the tension I had built. The psychological domination was far more satisfying than the financial one. They were finally learning that mocking someone who had always been kind and supportive comes with consequences. My retaliation wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. It was precise. Every action, every pause, every subtle move was a reflection of the years of being ignored, laughed at, and undervalued. And as I plotted the next steps, I realized that the ultimate lesson wasn't just about money or inconvenience. It was about respect. They had to understand that dismissing someone like me came with a cost, a price they weren't prepared to pay. And as the days passed, their anxiety grew. My father's attempts at control became more frantic. My sister's attempts at manipulation more desperate. I stayed calm, deliberate, untouchable. Every message I sent, every meeting I attended, every financial redirection was carefully calculated. I wasn't just retaliating. I was teaching them a lesson that would resonate for years to come. But I knew this was just the setup. Part of me thrilled in the chaos I was creating, but the best, the most satisfying part of my retaliation was yet to come. My family had underestimated me for decades, believing I was meek, compliant, and powerless. Now, with every move, every subtle disruption, every moment of confusion I orchestrated, they were beginning to understand the real cost of their arrogance. Sitting alone one evening, reviewing the messages, the calls, the subtle chaos, I allowed myself a private moment of triumph. I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life, my power, and my dignity. And the best part, they had no idea what the next chapter would bring. Because the most potent revenge, I realized, isn't just about punishment. It's about transformation. It's about reclaiming your own identity, your own voice, your own strength. And by the time I was done, they would know the true meaning of underestimating Sofia Marlowe. I had learned to sleep with plans in my head. Even then, sleep came in fragments, shallow pockets of rest between plot points and contingencies. The last weeks had been a masterclass in patience and cruelty measured out like medicine, bitter but necessary. I had unmasked them slowly, publicly, surgically. I had made them feel small in social rooms where they'd once felt so large. I had demanded accountability and watched them scramble to pretend they'd always intended it. But they were stubborn in the way people who have never had to lean on anyone are stubborn. Their pride was a second skin, and the thing about a second skin is that when it tears, it leaves the real thing exposed. I needed the tear to be unavoidable, a nudge here, a leak there. This was not enough. The final act had to be irrevocable. I started with threads I knew were watched the least, the older relatives who kept financial records in tuck. Boxes and old notebooks, the community accounts. That served as social capital more than bank balances, the relatives who would rather borrow dignity from family names than pay their own debts. These were places where embarrassment would work harder than penalties. They guarded their reputations like trophies. To undermine reputation was to shift their leverage. Once reputation was shaky, everything dependent on it would wobble. I dug, not crudely, carefully. If you spend years watching what people say and do, you learn how to read what they never say. I found a set of receipts hidden in an old relative's drawer during a family visit that, when traced, linked to expenses they had reported as personal, but which in reality had been charged to community accounts that I knew my father accessed. I found messages that contradicted their public narratives, conversations where my sister celebrated the comforts of gifts and nights out, texts congratulating herself on getting another freebie from Sofia. That sting of betrayal, once documented, was a weapon. I had a choice then: go scorch, turf, and drag every misdeed into a public trial, or pick the exact fractures that would force genuine reckoning. Revenge for the sake of spectacle is easy. Revenge that returns a family to a healthier, less exploitative baseline requires discernment. I chose the latter. I convened a private meeting with a vendor who had been silent out of deference for years. She arrived in a modest dress, hands folded, eyes wary. I didn't want to embarrass them, she said. People come to me in good faith. I gave her the receipts, the dates, the bank traces. Her jaw tightened. If I publish this, everyone will know where the money came from. I nodded. Then publish it, on the condition we frame it as a story about invisible labor, about people who shoulder others' lives and get nothing but jokes in return. Not names at first, context. She hesitated. The world is messy about family. Are you sure? She asked. I am certain. I said, I want them to understand the cost of the life they've treated me as part of, so others can see it before they fall into the same invisible work. And I want them to see they can't gaslight the truth away. We agreed on a measured piece, a human interest story that used no slander, but traced the pattern of unpaid emotional and financial labor in a way readers would recognize. It published in a local column with a calm, observant voice. I did not put names, I did not need to. People recognized gestures, not always faces. They recognized mine in the details. Comments poured in, some sympathetic, some skeptical, some accusatory. The seed had been planted. Then the veterinarian incident happened. It was small in the scheme of things, but brilliantly symbolic. One of my cousin's children, bright, loud, childlike, had a pet dog with a chronic illness. For years I had quietly covered veterinary bills when relatives ran out of cash. It was what I did. This time I let the overdue notice sit. The family, scrambling, called me with thinly veiled pleas. I answered, cold and precise. I'll help if the family acknowledges the contributions honestly and sets up a fund transparently managed. The outrage was immediate. You can't hold a child's pet as collateral. Someone texted, that is cruel. I let that message hang. Cruel, maybe, necessary, absolutely. The child's health issue had become a symbol of dependency. Someone else always stepping in when money ran thin. If habit didn't change, the cycle would repeat. By now, the groom's family was tired. They had been walking through a carnival of micro-disasters. Their social calendar disrupted, vendors cautious, acquaintances whispering. The groom's parents tried to insulate themselves, but in private meetings their irritation spilled into blunt talks with my father, their voices soft enough to remain respectful and sharp enough to wound. My father, who had always been a man of stern reserves, now lurched between indignation and pleading. He asked for meetings for signatures for any means to stop the hemorrhage of embarrassment. Pride will pay if humiliation becomes unbearable. And then the night came when everything shifted. The family had arranged a pre-wedding showcase, a small, curated gathering of the most important people, meant to reassure anxious relatives and seal deals. My father asked me to attend in spite of everything. He wanted me to play the part of conciliatory daughter. He wanted to remind people there isn't really anything wrong. He thought, perhaps, that my attendance could be used as proof that all was well. I almost didn't go. I thought about it. How often had I been a prop in their pictures of perfection? But I realized the showcase was an opportunity. If they wanted to display me superficially, I would not be a prop. I would be visible. I arrived early, dressed in an outfit that said I belonged to no one's background, but my own simple, clean lines, eyes that watched. Inside, the room smelled of lilies and expensive cologne. People glided through conversations, each one practicing polite concern. My sister fluttered by, still all ribbons and brightness, but there was a brittle edge now. She avoided meeting my eyes, that had not happened before. My presence was greeted by murmured approval among some and obvious discomfort among others. The groom's mother approached with a smile that barely hid relief. "Thank you for coming," she said. "We just want things to be normal again." I smiled back, purposely neutral. Normal for whom? I asked, loud enough for a thin cluster of relatives to hear. There was a quieting. People looked at each other like a chorus wanting to know the next line. My voice had the power to shift the room because it came from a place they had never acknowledged. I had a story, and it was cohesive, verified, and not subject to their spin. I told the truth, not a tirade, not a list of accusations. Facts with context. I described the months of financial juggling, the vendors I had rescued, the nights I had sat awake rerouting money to cover taxes they assumed were on autopilot. I spoke about the jokes, the laughing emoji, the texts that dismissed my anguish. I read a few unalterable items, 3 invoice numbers, a bank transfer trace, a vendor's confirmation that an amount had been paid when they claimed otherwise. I didn't shriek, I did not beg. I simply presented the ledger of our life together. You could hear a pin drop. Some faces flushed, others looked away. A few, shockingly, looked relieved, as if the weight they had been carrying silently for years had finally found an outlet. The groom's father, a man with a reputation for decorum, looked like he was struggling with a memory he hadn't wanted to examine. We assumed he began, then stopped. The assumption had been the problem. Assumptions allow illusions to persist. After I spoke, someone asked a question asked with the defensiveness of a person defending a castle's honor. Why now? Why publicize? Because we kept asking for respect and only received lectures. I answered. Because private promises dissolved as quickly as water. Public accountability is a structure. It prevents polite theft. The room divided itself into 2 slow currents. One current moved toward accountability, a cousin offering to audit accounts, a friend volunteering to mediate vendor relations, a quiet uncle suggesting contracts. Another current recoiled, clinging to an image they'd rather preserve, insisting the situation was overblown and that I was making mountains out of molehills. The cleavage was final. You cannot have both a myth and its dismantling in the same breath. After the showcase, an unexpected ally approached me. My cousin Rizwan. He had been watching all along, but he'd held his counsel. "I saw what you did," he said softly. "You didn't humiliate. You made them answer. They needed that." He handed me an envelope, a small gesture that was far more symbolic than monetary. Within were copies of old family ledgers he'd dug from his attic, pages annotated with amounts I'd never seen recorded. He had been quietly compiling a record that matched mine. "If you want to take this further," he said, "I will stand with you." Standing with me, that phrase mattered. Change rarely happens with only one person pushing. The days that followed were not comfortable. There were angry calls, threats thinly masked as legal counsel. There were attempts to gaslight me in private, to remind me of birthdays, school events, things I had done in the past to remind me to feel ashamed. There were relatives who stopped inviting me to gatherings, but there were also gestures of reconciliations, small, awkward, and sincere from people who had been too timid to intervene before. The groom's mother called me later that week to ask how we could proceed with payments transparently. She spoke haltingly, but there was a softness, a tremor of understanding. I could have demanded everything: public renunciations, resignations, admissions that would have broken their pride permanently. But what I wanted in the end was a different kind of victory, structural fairness. The rest I had learned would come with time. So I proposed a formalized plan, a written agreement outlining responsibilities for wedding expenses, an escrow account with a third, party trustee, and a public acknowledgement in the family chat that named the accommodations I had made. It felt almost minor, paper and signatures, but formalizing the dynamics would prevent a return to the old patterns. Accountability institutionalized mercy. My father resisted, of course. Pride is stubborn when built on a lifetime of being in charge. He accused me of betrayal, of wanting to embarrass the family in front of outsiders. I told him, as calmly as I could, that my actions weren't about humiliation. They were about survival and dignity. "If being treated like an ATM is solidarity to you," I said, "then I choose a different kind of family solidarity, a mutual one." Slowly, painfully, they signed. Not all with grace, not all with warmth, but with enough compliance that the documents passed from hand to hand, and the escrow account was set up under a lawyer's watchful eye. Vendors were paid through that account, with receipts issued and copies circulated. The wedding was rebooked with transparency. The family chat, once a creak of derision, quieted into a space where accountability lived, if hardly gracefully. The real change came not from documents, but from repeated behavior. When my cousin offered to audit, it accounts annually, and vendors began to demand contracts. The simple force of new routine reshaped older habits. People who had previously expected invisible labor found themselves budgeting instead of borrowing. It wasn't dramatic, it was mundane and therefore, in the long term, far more effective. Months later, at a modest wedding that finally took place under terms that included respect and transparency, I sat in the back and watched the scene unfold. The band played a gentle song. My sister's laughter was real enough, less brittle than before. She caught my eye across the room and mouthed a small, uncertain thank you, and not an absolution, not even close, but acknowledgement. For me, it was more than enough. I had not set out to ruin anyone. I had set out to be unignorable. I had set out to force a family built on assumptions to face the ledger. In episodes of fear and outrage, of small cruelties and big consequences, I had reclaimed my life. Sometimes I still get messages, old friends asking if I regret what I did. Regret is a complex thing. I don't regret asking to be treated like a person. I don't regret the moments I used to spend ensuring others slept soundly while I kept my own alarms on. There have been losses. Some relationships didn't survive the honesty, and that hurts in its own quiet way. There have been unexpected gains, self-respect, new alliances, a life where I no longer measure my worth by the way my family divides dessert. People assume revenge is a cliff you throw yourself off of, but mine was a staircase, every step deliberate, each refusal to take the same path as before building something new beneath my feet. Revenge that rebuilds is rarer and lonelier, but heavier with consequence. Tonight, alone in my apartment, I look at the old messages one last time. The laughing emoji still stings, but now it is a relic, a small artifact of a version of myself that bruised easily. I have changed. The ledger is balanced in ways that matter. I have founded new limits with ink and witness. I have a cousin who learns to audit accounts and a sister who tries to say thank you without embarrassment. I have a family that will, for the foreseeable future, be more careful about what they laugh at. If you ever find yourself being taken for granted, remember this: visibility is a form of power. Documentation is a form of armor. Patience, when paired with precision, becomes a formidable force. You don't need to be cruel to be resolute. You need to be yourself, fully present and unwilling to pay for the world's inconveniences any longer. And if anyone asks what finally made me act, I will say it was the text that night. So sharp and small, stay away from the wedding. That sentence crystallized everything. It made the cost of silence obvious. My name is Sofia Marlowe. This was my retaliation. Not a circus, not a vendetta, a reclamation. If you liked this story and want to hear more true accounts of one person deciding they've had enough, stick with Her Retaliation. Subscribe. There are more stories to tell, and sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and loudly enough that the people who never listened have to.